belong.
The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery on Historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos at Waco.
Let's take a sidebar and listen to that oral history clip that Rick just mentioned. It's from an interview with Charles Armstrong conducted by Sandra Denise Harvey back in 1995. Well, welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. This is an episode I've been wanting to do for some time. It actually pairs well with the barbed wire episode we did a while back, just thinking about technological changes and the way in which they impact this community in which we call home. And I'm fortunate to have a friend who's an expert on air conditioning. And we may have lost some listenership just now. Stick with us. This is a fascinating topic. But Rick Tullis is with us today. Rick is a founding partner of Capstone Mechanical, current president of the Greater Waco Chamber of Commerce, school board member. He's a civil servant, and his list of accolades are long, but he also is excited about the history of air conditioning.
Is that my cue to get excited?
Got to bring the heat, so to say,
okay,
or the cool, I guess.
Yes,
bring the cool.
Yes. Is that we're going to do that this whole time?
No, that's it. That's the end of the puns.
All right, yeah, Stephen, I am excited to be here, and there may be one or two interesting things about air conditioning in Waco, and hopefully we'll find them. If not, then yeah.
Well, I can think of few technological innovations that impacted the South, and of course Waco and the West. And Waco's kind of centered on this dividing line between the South and West. Air conditioning had a tremendous impact on Waco, the development of Waco, and the development of places like Waco. What are your kind of thoughts when you think philosophically? We'll start with the philosophical.
The philosophic, yeah,
just about that kind of change. And
yeah, certainly in the 20th century, air conditioning was considered by many one of the greater inventions of the century. In reality, like most things, it didn't just happen at an exact time. There was a process that brought about air conditioning, and that's part of the story that we'll tell here in a minute. And Waco's a part of that story, but certainly having the ability to cool spaces, hot spaces like Waco, Texas, changed migration patterns. It changed industry. Many prior to having mechanical cooling, mechanical air conditioning, a lot of businesses would either shut down in the summer because it got too hot, or they were limited by their geography of where they could be. A few years back, I had an opportunity to go to Scotland and visit some distilleries there. And even there, very, northern Scotland, cool climate. I mean, there's a reason distilleries are there, because you have to have cold water to condense the alcohol vapors and make the whiskey. And so they would use at every distillery, there was a beautiful river running through the middle of the distillery with 45-degree water in it, and that was how they, that was the water they used for their process. Well, you can imagine, here in Waco, and I did get an opportunity to help with the Balcones distillery. There's a lot of mechanical cooling that's going on there because we don't have a 45-degree river running through the middle of Balcones, and so you just extrapolate that over all the industries that have some kind of process that needs cooling, and these machines that, as they were developed, really opened up industry that was mainly centered in the Northeast and brought it into the Sun Belt.
Yeah. Thoreau once said, once fire was invented, there became the necessity to organize life around it. And I think that we could say the same for artificial cooling. I mean, if you're listening to this, particularly in the summer, I mean, you're moving from cooled space to cooled space to cooled space. Even your automobile is a cooled space.
Yeah. I mean, think how it affected architecture. The way houses were built. You go into older homes in Waco, they've got large windows with big sashes. You've got maybe an attic fan that's built into the house. You got large porches, and that largely went away with air conditioning. Some say there were some negative effects, even socially, right? People used to
Mm-hmm.
hang out on their porches, and there was a lot more community maybe in a neighborhood because people saw each other. But with air conditioning, you go in your house, you shut the window, you shut the doors, and you stay cool.
Yeah, my building on Baylor's campus, built in 1902, renovated in the 1990s. The windows don't open. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a hermetically sealed space that's reliant upon. I mean, you would die in there if
Right,
the
right.
AC went out. Yeah.
Right. I often tell our team at Capstone that air conditioning used to be a luxury item. It's now life support.
Mm-hmm.
The buildings, certainly you could think of hospitals and places like that where, it's essential. But really, any modern building, if you don't have some way that you're mechanically heating, cooling, filtering, even in the world of COVID that we're living in now, the cleaning the air is just as important as cooling and heating it to the right temperature, and ventilating the building properly. So you think about those factors, and it's essential to our modern life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's go back to the beginning. Let's back this up a bit and just talk about how this evolves. Now, I did a little research when I was in my doctoral program on air conditioning in Arizona,
Mm-hmm.
which there, you had an evaporative cooling kind of model that doesn't so much work here as well. And so how are, maybe pre-AC, how are folks you talked about some architectural innovations to kind of create some breezeways and things like that, but how are folks kind of staying cool before artificial cooling?
Right. Well, as you're describing the swamp coolers, which I grew up in a part of Texas that was much drier up in the Panhandle, and the house I grew up in had swamp coolers. Our high school and our schools didn't have air conditioning. Some of the teachers may had a swamp cooler if they paid for one to put in their window. But that was the norm, and that worked in those environments really kind of as you get west of here into the more arid climates. But Waco, because we're so heavily influenced by the Gulf moisture, is certainly in a much more humid environment, which doesn't allow the swamp cooler to get the desired cooling effect that somebody would want.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of ways, people were just more acclimated to the weather. It's amazing. You look at the old Gildersleeve photos, and you see wool suits and hats.
Yeah,
it's like the 4th of July parade, and you're like, man, those they got to be dying. The dresses with all kinds of undergarments underneath them, all pillowed out, and so it was definitely a different time. I think of really early Texas, and you hear people talk about the dog run architecture of the cabins that were built on the frontier. It was the same thing. They kept a breezeway through the middle, and that's how they stayed cool. And they would strategically pick where they built it. Right, they would get it up high enough where it would get a breeze, and they could survive the summers.
Yeah, I have that shotgun house kind of design where you can open up the front door, and if the back door's open, you can see the backyard. Just a straight kind of breezeway through there.
And I know we're primarily talking about comfort cooling, but we also, in part of the story, we'll talk also about refrigeration and how that they're related, very related technologies and industries. Similarly, when you think about food preservation and what it was like to live, you had to eat what you kill basically pretty quick, right? You didn't have you didn't have anywhere to store it. There were things you could do to dry it out or pack it in salt, whatever. But even I've got a friend with a farm not too far from me that they've got an old concrete structure around a spring, and the history is on that the settlers would they'd store their eggs and other perishables kind of in this structure because the cold water coming out of the spring would help keep it cool and extend the life of those products. So there were things that people were doing. Certainly, if you go up north, they would actually harvest ice during the winter times, and they would they would pack it underground and cellars, and that actually plays into our story here in a second as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So, if we want to begin the story here, do we begin with the ice houses? I mean, is that kind of where this starts? Is that a good place to start?
No, it's a horrible place to start.
Well, then back it up from there.
Okay, so let me start. So the invention of air conditioning is a Southern invention. There was a gentleman named John Gorey. He was a physician in Apalachicola, Florida. And in the mid, 1840s, he began trying to solve a problem. And that was every summer, he would get a lot of sick patients. And being a man of science, he figured out, and this was actually common medical thought at the time, that this condition that would happen every summer was from the bad air, mal-air, the malaria, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yellow fever got called different things, and there were different forms of it. But this malaria that would happen, especially if you think about being in Florida, the wet swamps, and you'd start smelling rotting decay and stuff out of the swamp. So correlation versus causation here. The guys had the correlation figured out, right? This bad things happen when it gets hot.
Mm-hmm.
So he went through an effort, said, man, if I can bring these patients into our hospital and I can put them in a cool room and offset the hot air that's outside, let's see if that helps them feel better. So he rigged up a system where he was using blocks of ice that were being shipped down from the north, and blew air across them and kept the rooms cool. And sure enough, he started seeing favorable results. So these patients would feel better. So he was encouraged by that. But it was challenging because ice shipments were, not very dependable, and the cost of ice was pretty expensive, as it made its way down the coast. So
yeah, I'm doing the mileage in my head. That's quite a trip.
Yeah. And Apalachicola wasn't a big stop on the ice route. So, so being a man of science, there were other inventors out there that were playing with some different technologies and some things where, this was the Enlightenment, and, the Industrial Revolution is just kind of getting kicked off. And so there's a relationship between pressure, volume, and temperature that, we all learn in high school now, called Boyle's Law. And so he understood that if you compress a gas, it's going to get hotter. And if that heat transfers away from it, and then you let the pressure off the gas, now it's a much colder gas than it was when you started. So using that technology, he actually built his own little ice machine, and it would make little blocks of ice, and so he could use those with his patients, and again started seeing favorable results. Now, if you look in his notes, he also makes mention of something else that helped get rid of the bad air. Turns out in Florida they have a mosquito problem too, and so these patients laying in a bed, they're immobile. So in the hospital, they would put nets over them to keep the mosquitoes off of them. And he thought, well, hey, maybe that fine netting is filtering out some of the bad air.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, interesting.
That makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And so he thought between that, the filtering of the air with the nets and the cold, that I'm creating with this ice, maybe I'm figuring this thing out. Now, we can sit here in hindsight and go, what got figured out, 50 years later was the mosquitoes that was spreading the malaria. So he almost got it. He almost figured it out.
Got close.
Got right there. But okay, so here's the rest of the story. He gets a patent for his invention. So it's the first patented ice making machine, with a cooling purpose, of cooling the air. And so he's credited for that. So that was 1850. He got his patent, went up north to try to find some investors and turn this into a money-making operation, right? Figure out how to sell this idea. Well, he ran into a problem. He ran into big ice, right? So these industries up there, I mean, it was a major industry where they would cut this ice and, I mean, ship it all around the world, store it. So they came at him pretty hard about his unnatural ice that God didn't ordain. So,
yeah.
And
It's an aberration.
yes.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, Dr. Gorey, by 1855, he was broke and he passed away. So never saw the benefit of his invention. Now, there's a little bit to the lore. So during that time, he was friends in Florida with a Monsieur Roussard from France. So I think he was a cotton buyer from France or something, but he was in Apalachicola, and there's a story about their Bastille Day, and they were celebrating, and the Frenchman needed some ice for his champagne, and there was none to be found, and Gorey, showed off his flexed his muscles and went and made a block of ice for him, and they had their iced champagne. Well, Roussard, eventually ends up going back to France, and that kind of leads to the next part of our story.
So did he takes his tech with him? Takes his technology with him to France?
At least takes some knowledge, as the story goes, takes some knowledge of this and takes it back to France. And he's friends with a guy named Ferdinand Carré, Carre, Carre. And
your French is really
it's
strong.
About as good as my East Texas. And so Carre actually ends up commercializing refrigeration. He's the first guy that really is successful with it. And so there's some theories that maybe he got some ideas, but the reality is, if you look into his background, he and his brother had been tinkering around with stuff. Now, he might have been encouraged by what he heard back in America. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Carre's commercial success, a lot of it came during the Civil War. A lot of his machines got smuggled into the South because the South was cut off from their northern ice supply.
Yeah, blockade. Yeah.
Yep. So he saw some benefits there commercially, and then eventually in like 1876, he outfitted the first ship with a refrigeration system that was able to haul meat from Argentina to France, and kind of really started this commercial refrigeration trade that allowed for more global commerce and the shipping of food around the world. Well, also at the time in France was a young man, 34-year-old man named Andrew Muhl, M-U-H-L, Muhl, and he was a trained machinist, and he was a contemporary of Carre. Not real sure, how closely they worked together. It's not real clear, but he had a full knowledge of refrigeration as well. Tinkered around with it in France a little bit, doing small scale ice operations and ice cream making, which we could do a whole podcast on ice cream.
Oh man, I'm telling you, that's an early application here, which is fantastic. Yeah.
You'll see that in beer end up being.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah.
So those two, so Muhl, I'm sure is an enterprising young man, probably sees the market saturated in France, right? Carre's already got that thing locked down. So he decides he's going to go to Mexico and take his knowledge and set up ice works there. Well, according to the newspaper, the story that he gave at some point, his ship got knocked off course and they ended up landing in New Orleans instead. I mean, remember, this is the, that's 1865-ish, right? Yeah. I mean, this is, back the days of the Wild West, basically, yeah. Right? So he goes around the U.S., he travels up to the Northeast, tries to get some patents for his ice machine, and is not successful in doing that for some reason, but ends up back in San Antonio, Texas, where he marries a San Antonio girl.
Okay.
Yep, gets him to Texas, and sets up his first ice machine there. So really, in a short time, he sets one up in San Antonio, then Austin, And then in 1869-70 ends up in Waco.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can draw a line from what's going on in France to this first establishment in Waco.
Even all the way maybe back to Apalachicola.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. And so looking at my notes here, he gets some backers here in Waco. In fact, it's some of the men from the Medical Association, Mr. Sears, and a couple other guys. They get together, pull together about $20,000, and he builds his first ice works here in Waco, down on the Brazos River. In fact, you might find this interesting if you like the old bird's eye Waco maps.
Oh yeah.
There's a 1873 one,
Mm-hmm.
and if you look on that, it lists the major businesses on there, and one of them is his ice works, and you can actually see it. It would be,
What's the name of his ice works?
you
remember?
Yeah, not sure.
Okay.
I think it just says Iceworks Mall.
I see.
I
Okay.
think that's all it says on the map.
All right.
And they actually show the building. So, and I went by there today to look. So it would be, if it were still standing, that building would be right about where, right next to Indian Springs Park, where you go down to Waco Paddle Co. to go if you're going to go rent a
Just to the right of the Franklin Avenue Bridge there.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where it stood.
Okay. A prominent spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there on the river. So think about this. This is 1870. Some pretty major things are happening in Waco at that exact time in space.
Oh,
so
yeah.
you had the suspension bridge
Mhm.
open up. You had the Waco Tap Railroad that just made it to town.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you had his ice works across there. You're kind of in the middle of the whole Chisholm Trail era. So I was just thinking about, it would almost seem anachronistic to be set in that scene, have a cattle drive going across the bridge, and some guy walk out with a block of ice that he just made in his shop. Right? I mean,
Yeah, Waco's top 5 in Texas in population at that point, as far as cities go. So there would have been a lot of activity going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and Waco was busy, but you say in the top five,
Mm-hmm.
but still that only amounted to like 3,000 people.
Yeah, not a
right.
ton of people.
You put that in perspective. You're like, wow. I mean, Texas as a whole only had a little over 800,000 at the time.
Yeah.
And most of that was all rural, right?
That's right.
I mean, there were very, very few cities. So, So Mole, he was able to. He did start generating patents. In fact, there's several of them listed that he got while he was in Waco for improving his machines, and he helped set up some other ice houses in the area. He had 13 kids.
Oh my
in the midst
goodness!
of all that.
Yeah, you
So-
better be selling some ice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And one of his sons, J.A. Mole, continued on the family tradition. And we'll see in a minute. He ended up running some of the other ice works in Waco as time went on.
Okay.
All right, so here's an interesting excerpt I was going to read real quick.
Please.
Out of the 1876 Waco-McLean County handbook, where they talk about the ice manufacturing company. So, okay, so it says in 1869, Dr. Owens, Mr. Sears, Mr. Coates, and Mr. Mull procured very valuable machinery at the cost of $20,000 odd for the manufacture of ice and began operations. They have shipped they have supplied Waco since that time with an artificial ice, which is 15 degrees colder and in purity and general good quality superior to natural ice, which I'm sure would be the case if you're cutting your ice out of the Brazos River.
Yeah.
They have a capacity to manufacture 5,000 pounds per day, a quantity sufficient to supply the present wants of the city. So
That's a lot of ice.
Well, let me put that in perspective.
Yeah.
So, in terms of ice, so 5,000 pounds, so that's 2.5 tons of ice. So if you have an air conditioner at your house, the guy comes to work on your air conditioner, sell you a new one, it's, hey, do you have a 3 ton, a 5 ton, a 2.5 ton? And basically that unit of measure, and seems pretty old school, and our industry still does it this way, but that is the tonnage of an air conditioner is the equivalent to that tonnage of ice melting over a 24-hour period.
I had no idea. Of course, I know that's how we rate air conditioners, but I didn't know that's what it came from.
Yeah. So literally a 2.5 ton air conditioner, if you have one of those at your house, that would be the equivalent of having 2.5 tons of block of ice in your house melting over a 24-hour period.
Wow.
And so when you think of it that way, that wasn't a whole lot of ice they were making, right? I mean, but I guess for their needs at the time, it was more than sufficient. And of course, the equipment gets better over time, and they're able to produce more ice. But
it was a time when 1 horsepower seemed a lot, but it doesn't seem much. It doesn't seem much now. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. You got to put it all in perspective.
So who are they supplying? Who do you think their customer base is primarily? And then I wouldn't think it's residential use necessarily at that point, or who are they supplying to?
Right.
Yeah.
Certainly some of it was novelty, right, for cold drinks or whatever, for the local populace. A lot of it, as we see it moving forward, and the other ice houses that end up showing up in Waco, comes from the transportation industry. So Waco had several railroads over time that were going through here. And so you can imagine if you were shipping beef up from South Texas, you'd have these major stops along the way, and they would have to replenish the ice in these rail cars until they got to the next depot where they could replenish the ice again. So that was one. In fact, not too long, after that, you get into the 1880-ish time frame. The one of the ice houses that you see oftentimes in Gildersleeve photos or read about is the Geyser Ice Company. In fact, that building's still standing.
Yeah,
it was actually owned by Anheuser-Busch, so you can probably guess what they used the ice for.
Yeah. I'm getting thirsty thinking about it.
Hey, put that down. You got to wait till after the show. So, in fact, his son, Andrew's son, J.A., ended up running that Geyser Ice Factory in the years that followed that. And I found an ad from 1889, just so you show you some progress, right? So in 1889, the ice factory was producing 10 tons of ice a day.
Okay.
So they were growing. We also started seeing other ice houses in Waco. The Big Four Ice Company was one of their competitors. In fact, it's it's got some interesting history with that the family that owned it. The
Beal family.
The Beal family.
Yeah, that finished out and resided in Cottonland Castle.
Yes.
Which is another episode.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and as we know, there's a audio clip of one of the employees of the ice company who had to haul ice up to the castle daily because that's how they cooled the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They had some kind of system set up where they would put in blocks of ice.
Said Waco, ride hard, it'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos said Waco, I'm safe when I reach.
Let's take a sidebar and listen to that oral history clip that Rick just mentioned. It's from an interview with Charles Armstrong, conducted by Sandra Denise Harvey back in 1995.
We delivered ice to the old lady Abel. She had up in there upstairs in the castle, looked like a deep freeze. It was a wide box, about this wide, and oh gosh, it was probably 8 foot long. And we carried ice from the truck. And by the way, Abil's owned part of Geyser Ice Company. Maybe at one time they owned all the gas company, and they were well-to-do people. And she was more like, maybe you might describe her like Elizabeth Taylor or somebody like that. She didn't associate with anybody except people in her class. And we'd go walk in there, and she just ignored us like it was an animal through there. And we carried ice bags away. We carried crushed ice in 100-pound bags, put on the shoulder and go up stairs, and then dump it into this big box. And this big box was our air conditioner. It had fans blowing over that and blowing air through the house. And we went for 2 times a day and fill that tank with ice. And the driver didn't get any money for that because she owned the company. That was a free deal.
The Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
Ironically, we're in the middle of renovating that house right now and putting in a real air conditioning system.
Oh, are you
Yeah,
really? Y'all
yeah,
are
yeah.
doing that project?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
So, also you start seeing, you do start seeing ice as time goes on getting used domestically in homes. You know, the ice box, right? Some of us may still call our refrigerator an ice box, but they literally were ice boxes at one point. And these the factories, you could either go pick up the ice. They also had substations in the community. They had delivery drivers. There's some cool pictures from Gildersleeve of delivery drivers. And there's a great one of the great Waco historians, Roger Conger, in one of his one of the transcripts I read from the oral history that you guys took of him years ago. He talks about being a kid, and that was his job at 13 or 14, and how at 13 trying to wrestle a 100-pound block of ice was a challenge. So. Yep. So, any questions on any of that?
Well, that's. I mean, I would think as Waco continues to grow, it's going to become an ice center for kind of this area of Central Texas. I would expect. I mean, I would expect that larger ice houses to concentrate in the cities, and they would do deliveries outside the cities. So, as ice usage increases, I see it affecting a lot of different industries. You've mentioned some of these that it would affect. We still haven't necessarily got to the point that we're thinking about how it's changing our living spaces yet. I mean, so we're thinking about it in kind of utilitarian needs early on, right? More than recreational needs.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and so one thing I wanted to point out, because certainly in the research of doing this podcast, one of the questions was, man, what was the first building air conditioned in Waco? Well, this may be lost. I think it's going to be lost to us in history, because there was an interesting point about Andrew Mull that I failed to mention a minute ago. He had an 1874 patent, and the way the patent was listed, it was listed as an apparatus for the improvement of cooling air in buildings. So I just have to imagine he was trying that out, right? Instead of just making ice, he was trying to figure out how to actually cool spaces inside of buildings. And for whatever reason, it didn't catch. I mean, he got a patent for whatever that apparatus was, but didn't catch on. And you think about a lot of it at the time, if you didn't have a steam engine handy, you really weren't going to do a whole lot mechanically, right? I mean, it wasn't like today where we go plug stuff in the wall and it works. So I could see that being a major, major drawback. Kind of back to those bird's eye maps of Waco. One thing I love is over time, there's 4 of them, I think. And over time, you start seeing, by the time you get to the last one in the 1890s, there are dozens of smokestacks with black stuff coming out of them. And, in our modern, culture, modern thought is like, oh man, look at all that pollution. But in the mind of a, 19th century person who's trying to sell their city, which was basically what those maps were for, right? They were, trying to recruit people to come to town. That was progress. That was industry. That was, hey, we're modern. Look at us.
Yeah.
We've got all these machines running in our city. So
I've seen pictures from the Philadelphia Centennial. So there's a big celebration for the 100th anniversary of the United States, the Declaration of Independence. And there's a sketch in there of artificial cooling, and it's people dressed, as you might imagine, in the period, and they're being blown away by artificial cooling coming in the room. And it made me think a little bit about ways in which we've got to grow to accept this new technology, that this is something you should be doing. You talked earlier about moving from natural ice to artificial ice, that, what is this strange technology that we may be bringing in our homes? And so there's the technological limitations to doing artificial cooling, but there's also growing to accept that this is what you got to do. Yeah.
It's funny, in one of the things I read of a contemporary article about using ice to cool your drinks and all that stuff, there's a little footnote or a little parenthetical note of drinking ice drinks, and it says something along the lines of, this was only after we determined that you couldn't freeze your stomach wall from consuming ice. So there was fear. Right?
Yeah, there was some
probably
concerns.
those big ice guys. Well, no, they would have told you to use ice.
Yeah, exactly.
So to tie a bow on a couple of these thoughts we just had on not only the production of ice, but the power, how you're going to do it. It really was, as time progressed and we got into the 20th century, and we started getting power plants in Waco and in other cities, obviously. And now you had electricity in homes. That's what killed the ice business, right? So now you could actually buy a refrigerator, and you didn't need ice deliveries anymore. And if you look at some of the advertisements, some of the stories, then it was the electric companies, and here TP&L, Texas Power and Light, was the power generator here in Waco. They would promote things like refrigerators because they wanted to generate more load on their grid, right? So they would, you didn't go to the department store or you didn't go to Best Buy and buy a refrigerator. You would get one through your power company. Yeah. And so over time, that's what ended up diminishing the need for the ice houses. The Geyser Ice House did continue on. It eventually got purchased by a company called Southland that it was the forerunner to 7-Eleven, and then eventually Ready Ice,
selling bagged ice,
right? Yeah, and its last vestige, the old Geyser Ice building, was a storage facility for ice that was probably being produced somewhere else before they eventually shut it down.
Mm-hmm. So I think of the 20s. I think of the 1920s as this period where, by that point in cities, you're getting on the grid. Most folks have access to some electricity if they're living in Waco. Mm-hmm. And so these sort of appliances that you're talking about would be the time we're bringing in the home. But it also seems like that would be the period where artificial cooling, the expansion of the grid might make artificial cooling more of a reality and more of a possibility.
Right. So the technology is catching up. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we'll jump back into our air conditioning side of the story. Mm-hmm. The guy known as the father of air conditioning is a guy named Willis Carrier. You might recognize that name.
I do.
Yes,
I do.
Yeah. So Willis was a young engineer in the early 1900s, and so he first, in trying to solve a problem at a printing press, there was a printer had problems with humidity, kind of gumming up his papers. It's going through his machine, and so he devised a machine that took the humidity out of the air and dried the air out so that this printing press could run better. Of course, it didn't take a whole lot of carrying that thought forward to realize, hey, I could actually cool rooms, right? And So that led to more development. Eventually, he was creating systems to put into hospital wards and theaters. So that continued to progress, and of course there were other inventors and other people jumping into the business at that point as well. So you're right. Really, by the 20s, we start seeing air conditioning become mainstream in a commercial sense. Right, It really wasn't making it into homes yet. In fact, Carrier was credited the first high-rise office building to be air conditioned was actually built in San Antonio, called the Milam Building, and it opened in 1928. So that was the first full-scale, large modern building purpose-built with air conditioning in it. Certainly, you had smaller buildings or parts of buildings being renovated with an air conditioning system, and that happened here in Waco. So a couple of them that we've looked at or stumbled upon, the Roosevelt Hotel, I think in 27, 28.
Yeah, so it was a Hilton and then becomes
That's right.
the Roosevelt. 27 opened, and I found that piece where they're talking about, I think their dining room, and they had one other room that was air cooled. Not the apartments or the rooms,
Right.
but they had some common spaces that were
Right.
cooled. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you go out to the the Conrad Hilton historical website, they actually list that on the timeline as his first air-conditioned hotel.
Oh, really?
Public spaces only is how it.
Oh,
it-
interesting. Okay.
It denotes that.
Yeah.
But so similarly, the Waco history site talks about the Hippodrome. So another good commercial prospect, right? Public spaces like theaters, hotels, restaurants. I guess they'd had a fire somewhere in the mid-20s, and they'd renovated it. And when it reopened in 28, it had air conditioning. So those are two early adopters that we know about. Also came across an article about the Elite, not the Elite that we know on the Circle, but the one that used to be on Austin Avenue, and in like mid-30s, 35-ish, getting air conditioning. It was probably it said it was the first air-conditioned building in Waco, but obviously it wasn't because of the other two we just mentioned. But it was probably the first air-conditioned restaurant. Would be my guess.
Okay, I don't want you, Mr. Engineer, I don't want you to do a deep dive on this, but can you explain in simple terms, like, how do these early systems work? Like, are they cooling coils and they're blowing air over coils? Again, I don't want to go in a deep dive in this, but in general, how are they working to?
When you do a podcast, how do you do the whiteboard?
Yeah, see, I don't want that level of description.
Okay. Yeah, so basically the miracle of refrigeration, which I described a little bit earlier, using the relationship between pressure, volume, and temperature. So, and there's more than one way to cool things down. We're going to talk about the vapor compression cycle. So think about, you've got a gas in a closed system and you have a compressor. So what do you think a compressor does?
It compresses.
It compresses things. Good job.
Thanks, Rick.
So it takes that refrigerant gas that's in the system, compresses it, which heats it up. Then it goes through, you got two coils. You have a condenser coil, which is the one outside. So now this hot gas goes through this condenser coil. So it's hotter than the air outside. We know from the laws of thermodynamics is that heat is going to transfer from something hotter to something colder. So if you make that coil outside hot with the hot gas in it, you're going to a bunch of that heat's going to go to the outside. And so now you have and it's going to condense. That's why it's called a condenser. So it goes from a vapor to a liquid, then that liquid comes back inside the building, and the pressure gets dropped. So it's high pressure. So you have a little valve, and as that liquid goes through that valve, the pressure drops drastically. So now you got a really cold liquid and gas mixture that goes through your evaporator coil. So as the name implies, now that liquid gas mixture completely evaporates. So it absorbs a bunch of heat in the air that's blowing across it, and takes the air in the room from 75, 80 degrees down to 60, 55 degrees, somewhere in that range, and blows it back into the space.
Okay, so you're describing to me what I would think of as a modern air conditioning system. I mean, in other words, I can think of how the internal combustion engine has changed in the car since the 20s, but that doesn't sound radically different than what I might see inside my unit if I broke it apart right now.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The essential technology hasn't changed at all.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it turns out the laws of physics hold true in 1902 as in 2022.
Yeah.
But certainly the machines have gotten more efficient. There's more technology involved, similar to the internal combustion engine. It's technically the same engine, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, now you're getting 40 miles a gallon instead of 8.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Interesting.
so yeah, they essentially worked the same. Now it was you know, each of these systems was a custom system put together. So that'd be a difference to think about too. So they were very expensive, custom built, custom designed for every space. You know, there was no off the shelf components, and as time goes on, you start to see that happen. In fact, it's in the as you get kind of post World War II, and really some of these inventions happened before, but because of the industrial boom of the war era, you know, now we start seeing window air conditioners being mass produced. A company called Friedrich, which was down in San Antonio. We've mentioned San Antonio quite a bit this podcast.
Yeah.
Became one of the major producers of window units post-war. And so a lot of these houses that were not built for air conditioning, you know, you could at least put one in a room somewhere, right? And now you had some amount of cooling. So that was how most of them converted early on. But then you started seeing housing developments in the 50s start to be built, purpose-built with air conditioning, kind of a different architecture, kind of we talked about, and insulation of the home, everything started ratcheting up. Yeah, and same thing commercially. I'm not sure what the first purpose-built commercial building was in Waco to have air conditioning, but I do know at Baylor, because I can go back and look at those plans. You guys have a lot of them digitized on site, on your archive site. The Armstrong Browning Library, which was kind of designed mid to late 40s, actually built, opened up in 1950, was purpose-built with an air conditioning cooling system in it, not just a heating system, not just a ventilation system. So I don't know if that's the first one in Waco, but you know, some that were kind of close in age. I mean, Waco Hall was built certainly after the invention of air conditioning, and it had an extensive ventilation system in it.
Yeah. Yeah, 1930, I think it's finished.
Yeah. But it just had a massive ventilation system in it. So, you know, back then in the summertime, you know, you wouldn't do events in your theater like that or in your hall. In fact, it was just a few years ago. The Masonic headquarters over here, not too far from where we're sitting, my friends at Lockridge Priest renovated that building and put air conditioning in it for the first time. It had a massive ventilation system. And in fact, so the state Masonic meeting could only happen right at a certain time of the year, you know, December, January-ish time of the year, because that's the only time they could keep the building cool enough for an auditorium that large with that many people in it. But as you can imagine, that pattern played out all over the place pre-air conditioning. You know, in summertime, people just did not gather in those spaces. So,
yeah, to connect the story of the Hilton, which becomes the Roosevelt, I saw an ad from the 50s that's advertising all rooms cooled. You know, so like that, you know, that next. Yeah, so the Depression's going to slow this down. World War II is going to slow this down. But post-war, I would think AC is going to, like the television, is going to kind of take off.
Yeah, and I can tell you in the 1950s and 60s, many of the buildings, historic buildings, and even the new buildings that were built at that time, start showing up with air conditioning in them. You know, we've worked in a lot of these buildings that are kind of on their second or third generation of air conditioning systems, and I mean, you go down in the bowels of these buildings, and if you're a guy like me, you think it's really cool. These really old equipment and the way it's running, and sometimes it's almost a shame to rip it out to put in the modern stuff, but it's certainly needed. And so as that becomes mainstream, right? A lot of the churches, the businesses, academic buildings at Baylor start to get converted. That's when we start seeing some recognizable names in the air conditioning industry in Waco. So Jacobs Cathy, one of the company that's been around since 1956. Lockridge Priest was started in 1963. And there were several others that didn't make it.
Yeah, sure.
But those are two that I think most people would see those names around town and recognize them. And of course, they're named after the guys who started them. So I mean, those were the pioneers.
And I would think by this point we're standardizing systems. We're not custom building like the houses they're building in these subdivisions. Right. We're mass producing units, and the cost is coming down because of that.
Cost is coming down. One of the places too. I mentioned my high school didn't have air conditioning. Did yours?
It did. Yeah, East Texas. It did. Yeah.
Wow, you guys.
Yeah, we needed it. Extremely humid, also. Yeah.
But I bet many of the people who went through school in Waco in the 70s and 80s didn't have air conditioning. So it was really during that time where you started seeing schools investing in that technology and start purpose building schools. That way you can really notice the architecture changes because you drive by a school that has no windows. Now, it looks not very aesthetically pleasing, but that was the reason, right? Because windows are not as efficient and stuff like that started to get really minimized. Yeah. So, at this point it becomes almost ubiquitous, right? It becomes a normal part of society and something that's expected everywhere. We also, Waco, benefited from some industries related to the air conditioning business as well. Not just the contractors that I mentioned before. There was a gentleman named Herb Kay, who was an Aggie engineer who started manufacturing air conditioning systems here and started a company called Command Air. He was actually fairly innovative, so he was one of the early adopters or one of the early experimenters really into what's called ground source heat pumps. So instead of rejecting the heat to the air, using, putting pipes in the ground and using the ground as your cooling source and heating source at times too. So that technology actually got him acquired by the Train Company in the early 90s, 1991. So he sold out to Train, and many people may be familiar with the plant out towards McGregor on Highway 84. So that was Command Air, and then eventually Train. And ironically, that's where I started my career in 1993.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
As big a deal as that Frenchman coming to Texas, I think. Yeah.
Almost. Maybe this podcast might get me there. So, another industry I know about that actually produces components for air conditioning systems that's still here in town is Packless Industries on Imperial Drive. So they produce heat exchangers and other things. I'm not sure when they started in Waco. The company's been around since 1933, so they've been doing it a while. And I think another interesting note would be our friends at TSTC. So I don't know how much you've covered their history, but 1965, old Air Force Base converted into technical college, and one of their early programs was the air conditioning program to train technicians for really the whole state. So they've produced thousands of technicians that we all rely upon. So.
So when would you say Waco crosses the meridian of air conditioning no longer being a luxury but a necessity? Like with the automobile, I would say the 20s is kind of when that happens.
Sure.
But yeah.
Yeah, I'd say in the 60s and 70s is really when you're making that flip. at that point, even if you don't have a centralized air conditioning system, you're getting a window unit or something. And there's probably very few houses at this point that don't have some kind of mechanical cooling.
We've talked about a few landmarks. I'd love to ask about the Alico building, about just because it's such an unusual structure in a lot of different ways. But and I know they had their own artesian well down in the basement. They're self-sufficient as far as their water supply goes. So I know they had to think about cooling. And so are you familiar with what they had in that building?
Yeah, I know a little bit. I've been down in the bottom of that building, and it is super cool. I mean, it's like you feel like you're in the bottom of a ship, right, in the bowels of a ship. There's still a huge boiler down there, and they would use that artesian water in the boiler to steam heat the building. We really haven't talked about heating. I mean, right? Part of air conditioning is heating, but that does bring up a good point. A lot of these systems, especially in large buildings, that they already had a steam heating system in them, and this happened a lot in the Northeast as well in those older buildings. The way to convert them to cooling, the easiest way to convert them to cooling, was then to put in a chilled water system, use the same pipes, change out the steam radiator, put a little, what's called a fan coil, put that in instead of the radiators. And so now you magically had heating and cooling.
Okay, so the piping heating system becomes your ductwork for your cooling system, becomes kind of your passageway for your cooling system.
Right. Yeah. You're circulating that chilled water, 45 degree water, then to be used at those fan coils to cool the air.
Yeah. Okay.
So, so that conversion at some point took place at Alico. I couldn't find exactly when, but if you look on the top of the building, there's large cooling towers, so that's how they're rejecting the heat. And then they've got machines on each floor that are generating the cooling. So a good example of that as well is at Baylor. They have a district cooling system, right? They've got in the middle of the campus, they have a facility that just generates cold water. And that cold water is in pipes that circulated around the whole campus. And so most buildings have a tap onto that, and taps up into the building, and then that cold water is circulated through the building that goes through coils, and then air is blown across those coils to cool the space.
Yeah, so that is a structure that's a mystery to most Baylor students as they walk by it, if they notice it there by the library.
Yeah,
but exactly. But I park there and I hear it at work. I can hear that process you're talking about at work with water flowing.
Yeah.
So.
And are you thankful when you hear it?
I am. Yeah,
good.
I'm probably not as much as I should be, but this will help. So I wanted to ask you to come full circle a little bit. You said Capstone did the Roosevelt renovation. And so we talked about the Hilton becomes the Roosevelt as one of the first systems in a commercial building in Waco. We don't know if it was the first, but it was one of the first. Can you talk a little bit about that project?
Yeah. So developer in town, a guy named Mike Clark, I guess he took over in between being a hotel and the renovation. It was St. Regis. I think
it had several different lives along the way.
That eventually moved out to Providence, and so I think that's when Mike got a hold of it. So he basically demoed it down to its bones, and we designed had to redesign the plumbing, had to redesign the air conditioning system, and in buildings that weren't designed for all those systems, it's pretty tricky, right? I mean, there's not spaces to run pipes and to do that kind of stuff. So we had to get creative, came up with some systems. Capstone didn't actually install the system. We installed the plumbing, but that's what got installed. And if you go in that building now, it feels great. Looks beautiful.
They did a great job. They did a great job with that.
It's a great example of a historical preservation, and that happened all up and down in these buildings on Austin Avenue. Similar thing, the Raleigh Hotel. It got renovated. It's on multiple renovations of the original air conditioning system that got put in after it was built. In fact, when I look at the old Gildersleeve's photos from the beginning of the century, he's got some great shots of kind of down Austin Avenue from the rooftop of one of the buildings, and it's really cool. But it's sometimes when you look at those pictures, it's what you don't see that grabs your attention. So for me, I don't see air conditioners on the roofs of all the buildings, and so it seems really strange to me.
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny. Well, what else do we need to kind of finish out the story here as far as kind of, if I think of the last era of, AC, maybe the last 30 years or so, I mean, what's your career as you've been involved, and what have been the advancements and kind of the things that have been implemented in those years?
Yeah, so really what's happening now, I mean, we continue to improve the efficiency. I mean, air conditioning consumes a huge part of the power consumption in America.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of effort to reduce that, and you do that by building better buildings, right? Codes have gotten more stringent on insulation and glass and other things to make buildings more efficient. So there's certainly been advancements there in just the construction science. Then the equipment's more efficient, but just like we see in other industries, it's the digital revolution that's probably having the biggest effect on air conditioning right now. Making systems smarter. Everybody's seeing the little Nest thermostat that
Mm-hmm.
can learn your patterns and turn your unit up and down as it gets to know you better. Certainly Andrew Moll would never have imagined that. In large commercial buildings, I mean, we put in some pretty sophisticated control systems, that are integrating all kinds of things from lighting to security, air conditioning systems, whatnot. So you not only can schedule, but you can diagnose things, see problems, optimize it. So I think that's going to continue to move forward. There's been some slight advances, obviously, in the systems. But at the end of the day, it's the same technology that John Gorey tinkered around with in 1850. So.
Well, this connects back to your career a little bit because I'm very proud of our chamber building, just being a green certified, and so on a level of that, I mean, what is that required? I mean, how is that building? Is it cooled differently in a way that would make it achieve that sort of rating? I'm not sure what all that involves. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So to achieve, there's different levels of that credential.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, in all phases of the construction project, you can earn points different ways. And so certainly the better you insulate the building, the kind of glass you use, where you source the materials, what kind of roof you put on, what kind of air conditioning system you use. Some of those things get you to so many points that get you that rating. And we did the air conditioning on that building as well, and I mean it has a very modern, nice system. It's not extravagant. It's not over the top, but yeah, very 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 efficient building.
Well, it seems to me we think of things that we ignored for a long time. The afternoon sun orientation, shading, things like that. That in the height of the AC. I mean, when we're getting modern, 60s, 70s, 80s, we're kind of ignoring these things. But it seems now there's at least some attention or some consideration made to those sorts of factors. Yeah,
and certainly when architects are laying out buildings or houses, you're thinking about orientation and the solar loads that are associated with that, where you're putting glass and what kind of glass and awnings. You see a lot of awnings on buildings now. Those have kind of come back because really the best way to keep from transmitting heat through a window is to keep it shaded as much as possible. So, you're seeing kind of a way that our desire as a culture and a community to be more efficient, to be a better steward of our resources, we're continually transforming and getting better. And I can say, You know, in my time in this industry, so, you know, whenever I started in 93 to now, I mean, the way buildings are built is tremendously better. There was actually kind of a watershed moment in, I think, about 2000 when the codes changed drastically, and we started seeing, instead of just a hodgepodge of codes, kind of really a more succinct set of standardized codes across the state that were focused on energy efficiency. You know, so much so that you're much better. Any house you buy that was built after that is going to be built to a better standard.
Yeah.
I'm not discouraging people from buying old homes.
No,
Still buy those.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm going to always buy a house that was built after 2000.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, 30 years, Rick, is a long time. I mean, you've been in the business 30 years now, believe it or not. So
Crazy.
Yeah. Well, I know you haven't slept in days because you've been researching the history of air conditioning in Waco. So are there other tidbits that you want to make sure we get in here that we may have missed along the journey?
Yeah. You know, I would just finish up by reiterating some of the things we said. You know, you think about, or we don't think about all the advantages we get from refrigeration and air conditioning.
Yeah.
That have almost become lost to us because they're so common. But some of the things we talked about, the population boom for the South, I mean, that's well chronicled how that made a big difference. You know, industry or, you know, GDP or our ability to be productive. You know, in Waco, Texas, we, you know, we've had 2 awesome back-to-back years in economic development, and major industries coming to town. You know, I think about some of these companies that we've attracted. I'm trying to think, almost all of them are fully air-conditioned buildings. Maybe, you know, some of them have some manufacturing spaces that are ventilated and not air-conditioned, but, you know, that wouldn't be happening if we didn't have these technologies. Yeah, I mean, think about something, we don't think about the internet being connected to air conditioning, but if you ever get a chance to tour a data center, even a small one, you'll be amazed at how much air conditioning it takes to keep it running. I mean, it's a major draw. In fact, a lot of the you know, data centers that are being built now are, you know, they're building them right next to a power plant because they are, you know, somewhere. I mean, there was an article the other day about Bitcoin mining. You know, there's some guys out at Bremond at the old mines out there because all the power infrastructure was already in place to run the mine. That's not getting used to the same extent. So it makes for a great place to put their little data center for mining Bitcoin. So
yeah, and that's interesting. And there's an industry where, I mean, loss of cooling could be fatal. I mean, could be devastating. Yeah,
very costly.
Yeah.
And something else we don't think about, and I'll finish with this one, is increased life expectancy. Right, we get a lot of our bodies aren't stressed near as much. You know, our food is safer, our medicines last longer. You know, there are a lot of you know, secondary and tertiary benefits that come from cooling that keep us alive just a little bit longer.
You made me think of Chicago. There's always deaths in the summer in Chicago when they have a bad summer, because they don't expect it to get hot, and it does every now and then in Chicago. So they don't have the cooling that we have. So you're right. I mean, I think that is a just an unrealized benefit, that it's an everyday thing.
Yeah.
So whether you're sitting in your car listening to this, whether you're at home listening to this, you can look up, you can look at in front of you and see if that cold air is coming out, and kind of reflect on the benefits that are being provided. And you could thank a saint like Rick Tullis, patron saint of cooled spaces. But Rick, it's been very cool having you on the Waco History Podcast. This is a long time coming, so I appreciate you joining me on this.
Yes. Well, I am thankful to be here. Enjoyed it.
Good.
Whisper again. Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
This has been a Rogue Media podcast.